So welcome to the topic of biodynamic craniosacral therapy. And let's begin with some defining the terms, talking a little bit about how biodynamic is different, and then maybe a little bit about the history of it as well, just as an orientation to the topic. So biodynamic craniosacral therapy. We will be very interested in discussing and learning general principles for all therapy. So we'll need to know about the autonomic nervous system. We'll need to know about how people can recover from unhappy events that occurred earlier in life using a body-centered method, especially using certain principles for trauma resolution. So that would be all therapy. And then within that, craniosacral is a derivative of osteopathy. Osteopathic medicine was established by Andrew Taylor Still in the late 1800s, and craniosacral therapy grew out of that in the early 1970s. There was a sort of a transplant of some of the osteopathic principles to a non-medical audience, and that is called craniosacral therapy. Craniosacral refers to the head and the tail, and how they have certain phenomena, relationships that can be developed and applied therapeutically. So then within that, biodynamic is a specialty area within craniosacral in which the method is indirect compared to more direct. And that's a big difference. Let's think about that for a moment. In a direct method, the therapist's job is to figure out what's going on and apply methods to change it for the better. And then an indirect method, the therapist's job is different. It's to create a supportive environment so that the correction comes from the inside out. So outside in would be the whole spectrum of the possibilities of all craniosacral, and inside out, an indirect method. That's the characteristic of biodynamic. And we could talk about this in a more expansive way, that all healthcare has direct versus indirect. There's a spectrum in the entirety of healthcare. And we have in this slide, you can see on the left the whole list of these are the attributes of the direct method. It is top down, it's centralized, its correction is from the outside in, it focuses on the symptoms, etc., etc., etc. A nice list here. These are the characteristics. And then an indirect method, you see corresponding on each line is the corresponding quality of indirect. And here we don't have to worry about figuring it out so much because the system of the client is going to be the authority in the process. And what we are trying to do is create a supportive field to allow the inherent health in the body to come back to the surface and reestablish itself. Direct versus indirect. The direct method is very well known. It's by far the predominant method in all healthcare. The indirect method is relatively less known, but in the research that has been done, it has been very well proven. An example would be that people recovering from surgery who they've had the surgery, that's a direct method, but the ones who are on their own versus the ones who have a support network, the latter group gets better, faster, and a more complete recovery. And something is happening from the inside out for those clients. And so the biodynamic approach is to use the principles of craniosacral therapy and then bring them through a biodynamic, an indirect approach. Down the middle of this diagram, you see some interesting things. There's a beautiful crop circle there with the Tao symbol of yin and yang. That is a nice emblem for a major part of the method, is the idea that we're going to use a body-centered method and gradually oscillate between two states in order to induce movement. The basic principle of polarity therapy. Then we're going to use, the second we see this apple shape, this is a reference from Randolph Stone, who taught that there's three poles in the body. There's a north pole in the brain, a mid pole at the heart, and a south pole in the belly. This is an Oriental understanding, and that we can oscillate from one of those to the other as well, from core to periphery, from top to bottom, and in any way that we can induce flow, we will restore inner resources for self-healing. And then next we see the caduceus, ancient symbol from Egypt and Greece. This was an emblem of the human body. The staff in the middle is the spine. The globe at the top is the brain. The two snakes crossing over 5 times is the yin and yang currents creating the chakras along the midline. And the wings represent consciousness. We're going to be using an energy-informed approach in biodynamic craniosacral therapy. And then lastly, we're going to really restore the missing link that was lost some time ago. And we see this emblem, the logo of the AMA in the early 50s had one snake crossing over a tree branch. And that's an adaptation, a graphic adaptation of the caduceus with 2 snakes. And we want to bring the second aspect back. We could call biodynamic an indirect method is a more yin method. The prevailing predominant method is a more yang method. And so we want to balance 50-50, bring both back in. We don't have to negate one in order to build the other. Both are useful and healthy. So then one bit, just to briefly get the history. This approach specifically begins with Andrew Taylor Still, the founder of osteopathy. His main contribution: focus on the health first. The health is never lost, or the person wouldn't be there. Build the health first. And then his student, William Sutherland, is credited with the discovery of a very subtle movement in the body. The body is rising and widening, descending and narrowing in a polyrhythmic pace, very small, very slow. He discovered that through his own experiential exploration. And then along the bottom we see key contributors in the next generation. Randolph Stone, his contribution is the link to Oriental medicine and the yogic mysticism. Roland Becker, his contribution is the 3-stage process. Also, Roland Becker gets a lot of credit for keeping the flame lit during a very difficult time in the 50s and 60s after Sutherland died. The work was threatened by mainstream practices, and he kept it alive. Robert Fulford gets special credit. His contribution was to emphasize the importance of this work for prenates and babies. And very, very significant aspect of the work, which I have explored in other presentations in my book, Working with Babies. And then lastly, we'd like to acknowledge in the next generation, Franklin Sills, who lives in Devon, England. He went to osteopathic college in England and stayed there. He was a polarity therapy practitioner and a very advanced, devout Buddhist meditator. And he pulled that energy anatomy from polarity and mindfulness from Buddhist meditation to add to his training in osteopathic medical school, add those into the package that we know today as biodynamic craniosacral therapy. So that's our quick overview of what biodynamic is all about.